It starts as a routine discussion until one moment shifts the entire conversation. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn, not because of shouting or chaos, but because two perspectives quietly collide in front of a daytime audience that wasn't expecting it? That's essentially what viewers witnessed during a segment that began like many others, casually framed and conversational, before slowly revealing a clear generational divide that would carry through the rest of the hour. And before we get into how it unfolded, make sure to subscribe to Table Turn and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. The episode opened in a familiar way, with the hosts moving through their early discussion topics at an unhurried pace. There was no warning that anything out of the ordinary was coming. The panel had already spent time on a political headline and a lighter pop culture item, and the atmosphere in the studio felt relaxed. The audience was settled, the hosts were smiling, and the conversation flowed in the way longtime viewers expect from a daytime talk show. When the producers transitioned to the next topic, the setup appeared straightforward. The conversation was framed around generational attitudes toward fame, responsibility, and public influence, sparked by recent comments Zendaya had made in an interview about navigating expectations placed on young celebrities. Zendaya was not present on the panel, but her words were being discussed in a neutral, reflective tone at first. A clip had just aired on the studio monitors, showing her speaking thoughtfully about how younger generations often feel pressured to be socially conscious at all times, even when they are still figuring out who they are. The clip ended to polite applause from the audience, and the camera returned to the panel. There was a brief pause as the hosts gathered their thoughts, a common rhythm in live television that allows the discussion to reset. Sunny Hostin was the first to respond. Her posture was upright, her hands folded neatly on the table, and her tone was measured. She acknowledged Zendaya's success and praised her intelligence, noting that she has handled fame with a level of grace that many people twice her age struggle to achieve. At the same time, Sunny gently pushed back on the idea that expectations placed on public figures today are unfair or excessive. She spoke from a place of experience, referencing her own background in law and media, and emphasized that influence has always come with responsibility, regardless of generation. At this stage, the exchange still felt balanced and calm. The audience listened attentively, offering light applause at the end of Sunny's comments. Another host chimed in briefly, attempting to bridge the perspectives by saying that both things could be true at once, that young celebrities face unique pressures, but also wield unprecedented platforms. The tone remained conversational, and the camera cut between the panelists as they nodded along. Then the conversation returned to Sunny, who expanded on her point. She questioned whether framing the issue as a generational burden risked minimizing the very real power that young stars have in shaping culture. Her voice stayed steady, but her words were more pointed. She suggested that younger celebrities sometimes underestimate how much their silence or engagement matters in moments of social tension. The studio grew slightly quieter, not in discomfort, but in attention. Viewers could sense the discussion moving into more serious territory. As Sunny finished, there was a noticeable pause before another host responded. The camera lingered for a fraction of a second longer than usual, capturing subtle shifts in body language. One panelist leaned back in her chair, another tilted her head thoughtfully. The conversation then pivoted towards Zendaya's broader message about generational burnout and the expectation to always get it right in public. A different host defended Zendaya's comments, emphasizing that younger generations grew up online, under constant scrutiny, and that this shapes how they view accountability. Sunny listened closely, occasionally nodding, but her expression remained firm. When she re-entered the conversation, it was clear she wanted to clarify her position rather than escalate. She said she understood the pressure of growing up online, but cautioned against excusing disengagement. She framed her point carefully, stating that social progress has historically relied on young voices stepping forward, even when it was uncomfortable. Her tone was calm, but the contrast between her perspective and the defense of Zendaya's stance was now unmistakable. The audience reaction shifted slightly here. Instead of applause, there were murmurs, a subtle indicator that viewers in the studio were processing the tension. This wasn't an argument in the traditional sense, but it was a visible divergence in worldview. The hosts were no longer simply sharing opinions. They were responding directly to one another's underlying assumptions. One panelist attempted to soften the exchange by acknowledging Sunny's point while also reiterating the mental health challenges unique to younger public figures. The camera cut to Sunny as she listened, her face composed but intent. When she spoke again, she emphasized that her critique wasn't personal and wasn't about Zendaya specifically, but about a broader cultural trend. She explained that every generation believes its pressures are unprecedented, but history shows that young leaders have always faced criticism, expectations, and public scrutiny. This is where the generational divide became more explicit. Another host, speaking from a younger perspective, countered that the scale and permanence of online criticism fundamentally changed the experience. She referenced how mistakes are now archived and replayed endlessly, leaving little room for growth without judgment. As she spoke, she gestured lightly with her hands, her voice animated but respectful. The audience responded with light applause, signaling resonance with that viewpoint. Sunny's response was immediate but controlled. She acknowledged the permanence of digital records but maintained that accountability has always involved long memories, even before social media. Her tone remained professional, but viewers could sense a firmness in her delivery that hadn't been there at the start of the segment. This wasn't hostility, but conviction. The exchange had evolved from commentary into a live negotiation of values. Throughout this part of the discussion, the moderator attempted to keep the conversation balanced, occasionally interjecting to ensure everyone had space to speak. These interruptions were gentle, the kind that happen naturally on live television when time constraints loom. Still, the pacing slowed slightly, a sign that the hosts recognized the weight of the topic and were allowing it to breathe. As the segment approached its midpoint, the studio atmosphere felt noticeably different from when it began. The smiles were fewer, replaced by thoughtful expressions. The audience was quieter, more engaged. The disagreement had not exploded into conflict, but it had settled into something more complex and perhaps more relatable, a calm but unresolved difference in how generations interpret responsibility, influence, and pressure in the public eye. And with that tension now clearly established, the conversation was poised to continue unfolding in real time, under the steady gaze of the cameras and the expectations of a daytime audience watching from home. As the conversation moved forward, it became clear that the panel was no longer just reacting to Zendaya's comments in isolation, but using them as a lens to examine broader cultural shifts. The hosts settled into a rhythm that felt slower and more deliberate than earlier in the hour. Each person spoke with a bit more care, aware that the topic had weight and that viewers at home were likely forming opinions in real time. Sunny took a moment before speaking again, which stood out because she's known for being quick and articulate. She adjusted her glasses slightly and leaned in toward the table, a subtle physical cue that she was about to make a considered point. When she spoke, her voice was steady, almost conversational, but there was an emphasis on clarity. She reiterated that she admired Zendaya and respected her achievements, stressing that criticism of an idea should not be mistaken for criticism of a person. This framing seemed intentional, an effort to keep the discussion from becoming personal or dismissive. She then returned to her core argument, explaining that generational conversations often risk turning into what she described as explanations instead of expectations. She said that understanding the pressures younger people face is important, but that understanding shouldn't lead to lower standards for engagement or accountability. Her words were careful, but firm, and as she spoke, the studio audience remained quiet, listening closely. Another host responded by gently challenging that framing. She pointed out that for many younger public figures, the expectation isn't just to engage, but to do so perfectly, immediately, and without error. She described how a single misstep can dominate headlines and social media feeds for weeks, sometimes overshadowing years of positive work. As she spoke, she glanced towards Sunny briefly, not confrontationally, but as if inviting her to consider that nuance. Sunny nodded, acknowledging the point, but didn't fully concede. She replied that imperfection has always been part of public life, and that growth often happens in public view. She shared an anecdote from earlier in her career, describing how criticism shaped her perspective rather than silencing her. The anecdote wasn't dramatic, but it grounded her argument in lived experience, and a few audience members murmured in recognition. The moderator stepped in briefly to contextualize the discussion for viewers who might be joining mid-segment. She summarized Zendaya's original comments, emphasizing that they centered on emotional fatigue and the pressure to be a constant role model. This recap helped reset the conversation and reminded everyone of the starting point, even as the discussion had expanded far beyond it. As the hosts resumed, the generational divide became more pronounced, though still respectful. One panelist framed the issue as less about avoiding responsibility and more about redefining it. She suggested that younger generations might express engagement differently, through selective advocacy or personal storytelling rather than constant commentary. Her tone was explanatory, almost academic, and she spoke with her hands, emphasizing certain phrases as she went. Sunny listened, her expression thoughtful but reserved. When she responded, she questioned whether selective engagement risks creating gaps in leadership during critical moments. She emphasized that silence, especially from influential figures, can be interpreted as indifference, regardless of intent. Her delivery was calm, but the implication was serious, and the audience reaction reflected that, with a few scattered nods visible in the front rows. At this point, the tension wasn't about disagreement in the traditional sense, but about competing definitions of responsibility. The hosts weren't talking over each other, and there was no raised voice, but the contrast in perspectives was clear. The camera work subtly reflected this, cutting between close-ups of individual speakers rather than wide shots of the panel, drawing viewers into the nuance of each argument. One of the hosts attempted to reframe the discussion by asking whether it was fair to place so much weight on individual celebrities at all. She questioned whether society sometimes offloads responsibility onto public figures instead of institutions. This shift broadened the conversation and momentarily diffused the direct comparison between Sunny's perspective and Zendaya's comments. Sunny responded by agreeing in part, stating that institutions do bear responsibility, but that influential individuals still play a role in shaping public discourse. She stressed that acknowledging structural issues shouldn't absolve individuals of their impact. Her tone softened slightly here, suggesting an attempt to find common ground. The studio audience reacted with light applause, signaling appreciation for the balanced approach. It was one of the first moments in the segment where the energy lifted slightly, even as the topic remained serious. The moderator smiled briefly, sensing the shift, and encouraged the panel to continue exploring that middle ground. Another host shared her own experience growing up in the public eye, albeit on a smaller scale, describing how expectations have changed even within her lifetime. She spoke about the speed at which news travels now and how that affects decision-making. Her contribution felt personal and reflective, and as she spoke, Sunny listened attentively, occasionally nodding. When Sunny spoke again, she acknowledged that the speed of information has changed dramatically and that this creates new challenges. However, she returned to her central concern, that framing young public figures primarily as victims of pressure risks overlooking their agency. She emphasized that many young celebrities, including Zendaya herself, have demonstrated thoughtful engagement, which suggests that responsibility and self-care are not mutually exclusive. This point seemed to resonate with the panel. Another host agreed, noting that Zendaya's own career often contradicts the idea that young celebrities are disengaged. She suggested that Zendaya's comments might have been more about setting boundaries than avoiding responsibility. This interpretation reframed the original issue and softened the perceived opposition between perspectives. Sunny responded positively to that reframing, saying she could appreciate that interpretation. Her body language relaxed slightly, and she leaned back in her chair. The tension didn't disappear, but it shifted into a more reflective space. The audience, sensing this, responded with a warmer round of applause. As the segment continued, the hosts explored how generational expectations evolve and how media narratives can amplify differences. The disagreement between Sunny's emphasis on accountability and the other's focus on pressure remained, but it was now contextualized within a broader discussion about change, adaptation, and empathy. By the end of this portion of the conversation, it was clear that no one was trying to win the debate. Instead, the exchange highlighted how even thoughtful, well-intentioned people can view the same issue differently based on experience. The studio atmosphere reflected this complexity. The audience wasn't divided so much as engaged, and the hosts appeared aware that they were navigating a topic many viewers were grappling with themselves. As the moderator signaled that the show would soon break for commercial, she thanked the panel for the thoughtful discussion and teased that they would continue unpacking generational perspectives after the break. The camera pulled back to a wider shot of the table, capturing the hosts exchanging small smiles and nods as the segment paused. The disagreement hadn't been resolved, but it had been aired in a way that felt honest, measured, and very much in line with the kind of conversations daytime television often brings into living rooms across the country. When the show returned from commercial, the tone was noticeably more focused. The hosts had the same relaxed posture they always do after a break, but there was a sense that everyone knew the conversation they were stepping back into required some care. The moderator briefly reminded viewers of the topic, summarizing that the panel had been discussing Zendaya's recent comments about generational pressure and public expectations, and how those comments had sparked a broader conversation about responsibility and influence. The transition was smooth, but deliberate. The moderator looked down the table and invited Sunny to continue her thought from before the break. Sunny took a breath before speaking, which again stood out. It suggested she was choosing her words carefully, aware of how easily discussions like this can be misinterpreted once clips start circulating online. She began by clarifying something she felt was getting lost in the conversation. She said that acknowledging pressure does not mean rejecting empathy, and that she wasn't arguing against mental health awareness. Her voice was calm, almost instructional, and she spoke slightly slower than earlier. She explained that her concern was about balance, about making sure empathy doesn't slide into lowered expectations, especially when discussing people who have enormous platforms. As she spoke, one of the other hosts leaned forward, resting her elbows lightly on the table, a sign of engagement rather than opposition. When Sunny finished, this host responded by saying she appreciated the clarification and agreed that balance was important. However, she questioned who gets to define what that balance looks like. She pointed out that expectations often come from older generations who didn't experience the same kind of constant visibility, and that this can unintentionally dismiss the lived reality of younger public figures. The studio audience reacted quietly, with a low murmur of agreement. It wasn't loud applause, but it was audible enough to register on the microphones. Sunny acknowledged the reaction with a brief nod, then responded by saying that every generation believes its experience is uniquely intense, but that doesn't mean earlier generations were unaffected by public judgment. She emphasized continuity, suggesting that while the tools have changed, the underlying pressures of public life remain comparable. The moderator gently stepped in to keep the discussion from circling. She asked a more specific question, directing it to the entire panel, whether Zendaya's comments should be read as a critique of the public, the media, or the industry itself. This reframing shifted the energy slightly, pulling the conversation away from generational comparison and toward interpretation. One host suggested that Zendaya was speaking primarily to the industry, particularly to how young performers are marketed and positioned as symbols rather than people. She referenced how press tours, social media campaigns, and branding often encourage celebrities to take stances on issues whether they feel prepared to or not. Her tone was explanatory, and she spoke with a softness that contrasted with the firmer exchanges earlier. Sunny responded by agreeing that the industry plays a significant role, and she criticized how young talent is often placed under intense scrutiny without adequate support. This was one of the clearest moments of alignment in the segment. Her shoulders relaxed slightly as she spoke, and the audience responded with brief applause. It was a reminder that despite differences, there was shared ground. Still, the underlying disagreement wasn't fully resolved. Another host returned the conversation to the idea of public silence. She asked whether it's fair to expect celebrities to comment on every issue and whether silence should always be interpreted negatively. She spoke thoughtfully, pausing between sentences, as if aware that this question sits at the heart of many online debates. Sunny answered carefully. She said she didn't believe anyone should be expected to comment on everything, but argued that patterns matter. She suggested that consistent silence during major moments can communicate something, whether intended or not. Her tone remained even, but her words were direct. The studio audience was again quiet, listening rather than reacting. The conversation then turned briefly toward how media amplifies these moments. One panelist pointed out that short clips and headlines often strip away nuance, turning thoughtful comments into simplified narratives. She noted that Zendaya's interview was longer and more layered than the excerpts most people saw. This observation seemed to resonate across the table. Sunny agreed, adding that media framing can intensify generational misunderstandings. She mentioned that debates like this often become polarized online in ways that don't reflect the original intent of the speaker. This acknowledgement softened the earlier tension and reframed the disagreement as partly a product of media dynamics rather than purely ideological differences. As the segment progressed, the pacing slowed further. The hosts spoke less frequently over one another, and there were longer pauses between comments. These pauses weren't awkward. They felt reflective, giving the audience space to absorb what was being said. The camera occasionally cut to reaction shots of audience members nodding or watching intently, reinforcing the sense that this was a conversation people were invested in. The moderator asked Sunny directly whether she thought Zendaya's comments had been misunderstood. Sunny considered the question, then said that yes, she believed some interpretations had gone too far. She reiterated that her initial reaction was to the broader conversation the comments sparked, not to Zendaya herself. This clarification was important, and the audience responded with a small but noticeable round of applause. Another host followed up by saying that this kind of discussion illustrates why generational dialogue is necessary, even when it's uncomfortable. She emphasized that disagreement doesn't have to mean disrespect. As she spoke, Sunny nodded, and the visual alignment was not lost on viewers. Toward the end of this portion of the segment, the moderator acknowledged that the conversation could easily continue for much longer than the show allowed. She thanked the panel for keeping the discussion thoughtful and respectful, even when opinions differed. Her tone was warm, and she smiled as she looked down the table. The segment didn't end with a clear resolution, but it didn't feel unfinished either. Instead, it felt like a snapshot of an ongoing cultural conversation, one that doesn't lend itself to simple answers. The disagreement between Sunny Hostin's emphasis on accountability and the other's focus on generational pressure remained, but it had been explored from multiple angles. As the camera pulled back slightly and the moderator prepared to transition to the next topic, the audience offered polite applause. It wasn't the loud, enthusiastic applause reserved for lighter moments, but it carried a sense of appreciation. The hosts exchanged brief glances and small smiles, signaling that while the discussion had been serious, it had also been productive. For viewers watching live, the moment stood out not because of raised voices or dramatic confrontation, but because it reflected something familiar, a generational divide playing out in real time, handled with restraint and mutual respect, yet still charged with real differences in perspective. As the show moved further along, the discussion lingered in the background even as the panel briefly shifted to adjacent points. The moderator, sensing that the audience was still engaged with the earlier exchange, allowed the conversation to organically drift back toward the generational theme rather than forcing a clean break. This is something longtime viewers recognize as a sign that a topic has struck a chord when the hosts themselves seem reluctant to move on too quickly. One of the hosts referenced viewer emails that had already started coming in during the live broadcast, noting that many people were responding strongly to the idea of generational expectations. She summarized a few comments without reading them verbatim, explaining that some viewers felt Sunny's perspective resonated with their own experiences, while others felt Zendaya's comments reflected a reality that older generations often underestimate. This acknowledgement immediately reframed the conversation as something larger than the panel itself. Sunny listened closely as the feedback was described. Her expression was neutral, but attentive. When she spoke again, she addressed the idea that her position might be interpreted as dismissive of younger voices. She was careful to say that was not her intent, and that she believes young people are often the drivers of progress. Her emphasis, she explained, was on encouraging engagement rather than discouraging it. The way she phrased it suggested she was responding not only to the panel, but to the unseen audience at home. Another host gently challenged that by pointing out that encouragement can sometimes feel like pressure when it comes from a place of authority or seniority. She said that even well-meaning messages can land differently depending on who's receiving them. Her tone was calm, and she spoke slowly, making eye contact with Sunny as she spoke. This wasn't confrontational, but it was direct. Sunny nodded and acknowledged that point, saying that communication across generations requires awareness of power dynamics. She admitted that perspectives shaped by different life stages can unintentionally clash. This moment marked a subtle shift. While Sunny hadn't abandoned her core argument, she was clearly making space for the idea that how messages are delivered matters as much as the message itself. The audience reacted with a light round of applause, the kind that suggests appreciation rather than agreement with any single side. The moderator smiled briefly, then leaned in and asked a question that brought the conversation back to Zendaya specifically. She asked whether Zendaya's influence might actually make her comments more impactful precisely because of how measured and thoughtful she usually is. This prompted a brief moment of consensus. Several hosts agreed that Zendaya's reputation for being careful and intentional is why her comments carried weight. One panelist said that when someone known for being engaged speaks about pressure and burnout, it invites a deeper conversation rather than a dismissive reaction. As she spoke, Sunny nodded along, signaling agreement. Sunny added that Zendaya's track record complicates simplistic readings of her comments. She reiterated that her initial reaction was less about Zendaya as an individual and more about how society interprets and amplifies such statements. Her tone was reflective, and she spoke more softly than earlier, suggesting that the intensity of the disagreement had eased. The moderator then shifted the focus slightly, asking whether generational divides like this are becoming more visible because of social media. The panel responded almost in unison, with overlapping affirmations. One host explained that platforms reward strong takes and quick reactions, which can exaggerate differences. She noted that nuanced discussions like the one happening on the show rarely translate cleanly into short clips. Sunny agreed, saying that she often sees her own comments reduced to headlines that don't capture context. She laughed lightly as she said this, and the audience responded with knowing chuckles. It was a brief moment of levity that helped release some of the tension that had built earlier. Still, the disagreement hadn't vanished entirely. Another host returned to the idea of emotional labor, suggesting that younger public figures are often expected to educate, advocate, and respond all at once. She argued that stepping back can sometimes be an act of self-preservation rather than disengagement. Her voice was steady, and she spoke with a seriousness that mirrored Sunny's earlier tone. Sunny listened without interrupting. When she responded, she said she could understand that perspective, especially given the pace of modern media. However, she maintained that public influence inevitably brings moments when stepping forward matters. She framed it not as an obligation imposed from outside, but as an opportunity to contribute. Her phrasing was careful, avoiding language that might sound accusatory. The studio audience remained attentive, with very little noise. This silence felt intentional, as though people were weighing both sides rather than reacting emotionally. The camera cut to a wide shot of the table, showing the hosts leaning in, hands resting on the table, eyes focused on whoever was speaking. The visual reinforced the seriousness of the exchange. As the conversation continued, the moderator began to steer it toward closure, acknowledging that the show needed to move on. She summarized the discussion in a neutral way, noting that the panel had explored both the pressures faced by younger generations and the enduring importance of public engagement. Her summary was balanced, and she made a point of saying that these conversations don't have simple answers. Before transitioning, she gave Sunny the opportunity for a final thought. Sunny took a moment, then said that she hopes discussions like this encourage more listening across generations. She emphasized that disagreement doesn't have to mean division, and that understanding different experiences can strengthen conversations rather than weaken them. Her tone was warm, and she smiled slightly as she finished. The audience responded with sustained applause, longer than at any other point in the segment. It wasn't thunderous, but it was clear and appreciative. The applause seemed less about endorsing a specific viewpoint and more about acknowledging the respectful way the conversation had unfolded. As the show moved toward its next segment, the hosts exchanged brief comments off mic, visible in the wide shot. There were small smiles and nods, signaling that while the discussion had been serious, it hadn't created lingering tension among the panel. For viewers, this visual closure mattered. It reinforced the idea that thoughtful disagreement can coexist with mutual respect. The conversation had evolved from a simple reaction to Zendaya's comments into a broader reflection on generational identity, responsibility, and communication. It hadn't erupted into a firestorm on air, but it had sparked something quieter and perhaps more lasting, a recognition that these divides are real, complex, and worth discussing without shouting. As the cameras shifted away, it was clear that the segment would continue to be talked about, not because of any single remark, but because it mirrored conversations happening in homes, workplaces, and online spaces every day. And that, more than anything, is what made the exchange stand out during an otherwise routine hour of daytime television. As the show approached its final minutes, the earlier discussions still lingered in the atmosphere, even as the panel transitioned to lighter topics. Viewers could sense that the exchange hadn't simply been another segment that came and went. The moderator maintained a steady pace, but there was a subtle awareness that something meaningful had taken place, something that would likely follow the show beyond the studio walls. Toward the end of the hour, the moderator briefly circled back, not to reopen the debate, but to acknowledge it. She thanked the panel again for engaging in what she described as a thoughtful and necessary conversation. Her tone was sincere, and she looked down the table as she spoke, making eye contact with each host. This acknowledgement felt intentional, as if to signal to viewers that the show understood the significance of what had just unfolded. Sunny responded with a small smile and a nod, her body language relaxed compared to earlier. The other hosts appeared similarly at ease. There was no visible tension, no sense of unresolved conflict between them. Instead, there was a quiet sense of completion, the kind that comes from having said what needed to be said, even if full agreement wasn't reached. As the final segment wrapped, the studio audience applauded, this time with a warmer, more casual energy. It was the applause of people settling back into their seats, ready to head into the rest of their day, but still carrying the conversation with them. The cameras pulled back, capturing the full table and the audience behind it, before fading out to the show's closing music. Once the episode aired, the reaction didn't take long to surface. On social media, clips of the exchange began circulating, though, as several panelists had predicted, many were shortened and stripped of context. Some viewers praised Sunny Hostin for voicing what they saw as an important reminder about accountability and influence. Others defended Zendaya's perspective, arguing that the segment highlighted how often younger generations are misunderstood or talked over. What stood out in the online response was that the conversation didn't immediately polarize into shouting matches. Many comments reflected the same tone as the on-air discussion, measured and reflective. Viewers shared personal experiences, talking about how expectations have changed across generations, and how pressure feels different depending on when and how someone came of age. In the days following the episode, several hosts referenced the discussion again, both on air and in interviews. They clarified that the disagreement had never been about attacking Zendaya personally, but about exploring a larger cultural question. Sunny, in particular, emphasized that she respects Zendaya and believes her voice has been largely positive and impactful. She reiterated that her comments were aimed at encouraging continued engagement, not diminishing the challenges young public figures face. Zendaya herself did not respond directly to the segment, which many viewers interpreted as consistent with her generally reserved approach to media commentary. That silence, interestingly, became part of the broader discussion, with some seeing it as validation of her original point about stepping back, and others viewing it as a reminder that not every conversation requires a direct reply. What made the moment resonate wasn't any single line or sharp exchange, but the way it unfolded in real time. It showed how generational divides don't always appear as loud arguments. Sometimes they surface as calm disagreements, pauses between sentences, and careful word choices on a live set where millions are watching. For longtime viewers of daytime talk shows, the segment felt familiar in structure, but distinct in substance. It followed the rhythms of live television: interruptions, clarifications, moments of agreement and disagreement, all handled within the boundaries of a format designed for conversation rather than confrontation. And yet, it managed to capture something deeper, a reflection of how society continues to negotiate changing expectations around voice, responsibility, and rest. In the end, the segment didn't declare a winner or deliver a clear conclusion. Instead, it left viewers with questions and perhaps a better understanding of why those questions matter. It reminded audiences that generational conversations are rarely simple and that listening, even when perspectives differ, can be more productive than trying to score points. And that's where the episode ultimately landed, not with a firestorm, but with a thoughtful pause, one that extended beyond the studio and into the conversations people were having afterward. Now I want to hear from you. Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Table Turn for more narration-based talk show stories.